and the group that we've got here. And let me very briefly introduce my panelists, and these are people who actually need no introduction. So I will skip their elaborate bios because that will take us to the end of our session time. So I will very briefly introduce them and then we'll launch right in. So we have Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was the former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission and a renowned policy maker and a thinker on all issues to do with policy in India. We have Sunita Narayan, who is the New Delhi-based Director General of the Center for Science and Environment and editor of Down to Earth. We have Ulka Kelkar, who is the Executive Director of Climate for WRI in India. We have Shiv Shankar Menon, who was a former National Security Advisor to Manmohan Singh and Foreign Secretary of India, and Ambassador to Israel, Sri Lanka, China, Pakistan. And then we have Lavish Bhandari, who's the president of CSEP, the Center for Social and Economic Policy. And this webinar is being conducted in a collaboration between CSEP and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So I'm really excited to have this discussion. So the question that I have for our panelists, for us to lead this off, the goal of Viksit Bharat, India as an advanced economy by 2047 being the 100th anniversary of India's independence. If you do the arithmetic, it roughly translates into an economy that is 25 trillion or so by 2047, given the assumptions about population growth rates, that would translate into a roughly $15 trillion, $15,000 per capita income. And do the arithmetic, that's about 8.7% growth rate year on year between now and 2047. So if that's the arithmetic, what is beneath it? What conditions need to be true? So I'm going to ask each one of my distinguished panelists here the first question, which is, what are the three most important conditions that need to hold for us to get there? So let me start with Montek. Montek, what say you? What are the three biggest assumptions that need to be true to get to the $25 trillion number in 2047?
I'm not a great advocate of fixing on some target 25 years away. I think if you try to do that in any country at any time, you almost certainly would get, assessments that would prove to be not very useful. Much more important to talk about what's the kind of growth rate India is going to get. And as you said, somewhere more than 7%. I mean, it varies. Some people think that in order to get the specific target that you mentioned, you probably need a real growth rate of 8+%. Many others feel that, look, that's a bit, it doesn't matter whether we reach that level in 2047 or 2053. The real question is, what's the sort of long-term target that we want? And I think many people say, even if we do 6.5% over the next 25 years, and remember, this is a 25 years in which developed countries are going to be growing much more slowly. Certainly Europe, certainly Japan, and even China is now projected to grow much more slowly. A 6.5% growth for 25 years would be a pretty big achievement for India. And remember, we are currently at the bottom, in the kind of bottom third of what is called middle income. And we want to graduate to getting out of this range into what the World Bank calls high income. And then you run into the middle income trap phenomenon, which is basically saying that, look, it's relatively easier to get out of low income to middle income. There are some low-hanging fruits, some obvious things to do. The next transition is much more complex. It requires handling things which involve a lot of institutional development, which is difficult anyway. And therefore, it's not easy to list what it is that you have to do. But subject to all that, I would think of really three things. The broad approach that this is going to be essentially a private sector-led development is probably not questioned anywhere in India. But can we achieve this without bringing the fiscal situation under better control? And are we at the moment on track to bring the fiscal situation under control? The problem is we are definitely not in a position where the fiscal situation suggests a crisis. But it's not very clear how quickly we are going to be able to bring the fiscal situation under control, given all the multiple demands on the state. Because most people, when they look at what's to come, have in mind the changing security circumstances, which certainly will require more expenditure on defense, the changing pressures of technological development, which will require a lot more research, not just by the government, but also by the private sector. And certainly health and education, where we are kind of lacking, where a lot of government expenditure is needed. And a lot of this has to come from the states. And of course, infrastructure in India still, it's better than it was earlier, but it's still not what it should be if you want to grow 6.5% over 25 years when everybody else is growing at 2 and 3. So that's going to require a lot of resources. And I think this is the central question. Will we be able to mobilize those resources? From a fiscal point of view, that really requires a restructuring of expenditure and a reshaping of tax policy. That's not impossible, but we need a dialogue which makes people realize that big changes are necessary. They're going to be controversial. So let's discuss them and get more and more people on board. That's one thing. Second, climate change. That's going to affect everybody. It's also going to affect us. And definitely, we will need a lot more expenditure on adaptation than we've been doing, which again adds to, and adaptation can only be done by the government. So that's going to add a lot to the burden on the fisc. In addition to that, there's our contribution to mitigation, which is part of a global compact. And that global compact isn't working out very well because the most recent assessment, and Sunita is the expert on this, but really the most recent assessment globally is that no country is on track to achieve the transition targets that they're talking about. So everybody's been asked by 2025 to come back with stronger commitments. I think we can and should make somewhat stronger commitments. But whether we do or not, it's going to depend a lot on whether the developed countries actually take a lead. If the developed countries in the next year or two actually don't intend to do anything, it will be very difficult to mobilize support for doing more, which I think we should. And it's also in our interest to keep the global consensus that we should do something alive. The other side of this just transition, of course, is the one on which there's very little progress. And that is this whole, we mount the slogan of just transition. We talk about developing countries must be assisted with finance, but the numbers are nowhere near what people are talking about. Now, it's quite possible that, until the US presidential election is over, nothing useful is going to be done on that front. So I think you can more or less write off the Azerbaijan COP, at least on the financing side. It's not going to get to any concrete results. But maybe the one that Brazil will host in 2025, which will be after the US presidential results are known and the new government is in place, maybe we'll get some sense of, is there a willingness to do something on the financial front? Because at the moment, what is being offered is like everybody says we need to do more, and everybody is doing a little bit more. But what's being done is a fraction of what is actually needed to bring about the change. And I think apart from that, there is quite frankly an Indian political constraint. I don't think our political class as of now has leveled up with the population. That look, if we really want to make this transition, energy is going to have to become more expensive. There seems to be some assumption that through some magic of technology, we will be able to do all this while keeping energy prices low. And quite frankly, I don't think that's really going to be possible. Now, how we translate that into action, I don't know. But a lot will also depend on what happens in other countries, because what we are seeing is not different from what other countries are doing. But if one could be, if our politicians are to educate our public, they have to be able to say that, look, this is what Indonesia has done, this is what Malaysia has done, this is what Brazil has done. It's never useful to say what China has done, because everybody says that's a different system, completely non-transparent. So, there are huge questions. I would therefore assume it's a very interesting issue to raise, lots and lots of problems, not a very clear understanding yet on how we're going to solve these problems. But clearly, serious action by the global community assisting countries that are serious about solving their problems would help.
So that is quite a list of issues, Montek, and we didn't expect any less. But as you were running through the assumptions, I was also noting so many different tensions within it. So, you brought us down from the lofty growth rate number that I had kicked us off with, which is 8.7. That is basically the arithmetic. And you brought us down to a 6.5% growth rate, with even if we were to nudge that up to 7%, we fall quite short of the Viksit Bharat goal. So there's a tension there, and he said that the fiscal situation needs to be under control. It's an enormously important issue, and how do we get there? And the other question relating to taking action on climate change, of course, enormously complicated not only because of the issue of how do we manage the just transition, and where does the funding and the financing come from, and how do we work with a global community of nations, but also internally looking at those growth rates, whether it's 6.5 or 4 or 8, there are going to be energy needs to feed that kind of growth rate. And how do we simultaneously balance that with a green transition? Let me turn to Sunita. Sunita, what say you? As we imagine 2047 and trying to get there, what are some of the conditions that, to your mind, need to hold? And perhaps you can respond to what you heard from Montek and build on some issues that he might not have touched on so far.
Thank you, Bhaskar. And Montek has put together a very, very cogent, very clear issues as we move ahead. Let me sort of draw upon them and look at it from the prism that I come from, which is environment, climate change, and look at where are the questions for 2047. Again, like Montek, it's too far away, and I would prefer to look at it in terms of what are the challenges moving ahead. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, for us right now is that we're at a very complicated time in history, global history. We are, when I was at the Rio conference, and Mr. Menon will remember that at the Rio conference, it just seemed so much more possible to talk about a world that would come together, a world that would make the transition happen, a world that would reduce its emissions. And today we have a more fractured, more polarized, more insecure world than ever before. You also have a world in which protectionism is growing more and more. You're getting questions of whether we are going to go on with the same form of globalization as we move ahead. And that is a question for us, because we are so wedded now to the model of globalization, where we have no other way for economic growth but to become a major exporting hub. And that is today at a challenge point in the world, partly because of environment, partly because of the fact that we are at a time when you have 2 wars, 3 wars happening. There is a physical war, which is happening in Ukraine and in Gaza, tragic, inhumane, disgusting. On the other hand, you have the other war, which is the war with nature, which we are losing. We are completely losing the war with nature. Climate change is here, and it is impacting every region of the world. And very clearly, like Montek said, it's taking away the development dividend as far as we are concerned. So we invest, we build roads, we build schools, we build water systems, and one flood, one drought, one cyclone, the kind of things that we are seeing today, massive impact on the development trajectories of our countries. But there is a third war, and that I think Mr. Menon is much more placed to speak about it, but it's a war that is affecting the green transition, the war with China. The fact is, China is today, say what you want, it's a huge leader. It's made its investment. It has a complete control over the technology, over the materials that are needed for the green transition. Now, can we do the green transition without those supply chains secured, without really thinking through whether that's going to be possible? So it's a complicated time in the world. And when I think back on where I came from, it just seems like a world which is a complete mess and getting worse as it goes on. Now, in that, how do we move ahead? And that, I think, is your question, Bhaskar, and that's what Montek is also asking. So I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that when it comes to us, it's very clear that our sustainability future will ride on us being able to build a more equitable future for India. The inequity that is growing in our countries, and it's not just India, this is a story across the world. But for us, the sustainability and inequity issue goes together. So if you don't get a functioning toilet in everybody's home, which you can afford, and you don't intercept the sewage of everybody's home, you will find out that your rivers will remain polluted. Now, the only way you can give everybody a working toilet and make sure you intercept the sewage is that if you can find a pathway, a technology, which is more inclusive. So for us, example after example, our sustainability issue is completely tied to the issue of building an inclusive society. And that means, and that's my last point, that for us, the biggest challenge, and I hope we will discuss that more, will be the new pathway that we invent. The fact is, all over the world, sustainability has always come after pollution. It has always come after economic growth. And the reason we have climate change today and we stand at a catastrophe is that we've always tried to fix it with a Band-Aid. And with those Band-Aids are just not working. For us, we have to reinvent the way we do employment as we move ahead. Nature-based solutions for employment generation, building on our forests, building on our water systems, building on our land systems. This whole vision that we've had that in India, of the size of India, can move away from land and move to manufacturing. And in a world which is much more protectionist today, in a world which is actually talking about building its own manufacturing capabilities, I think for us, the issue of employment of our huge numbers of people, and that then gets tied to the last of education, because what kind of education? Do you respect, do you get educated to be able to work that the issue of the livelihoods, which may not have been done anywhere else, but you may have to do. So I'll give you a simple example. I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm bringing it down to sewage and excreta all the time, but it's something that explains where we are, is that one of the biggest issues for us is that can you make energy out of the sewage that you produce? Can you make energy out of the waste that you have? Can you make sure that you do businesses out of the recycling, reuse, repurposing of the materials that you have? Now, all that is new employment and new ways of industrialization. And that's the biggest challenge, Bhaskar, that we still are locked. And that's the problem. We are mentally locked into a paradigm, an economic paradigm that has been invented in a world which is completely unsustainable. And that world does not know how to get itself out of a hole, and we are getting into that same hole. And that's the biggest challenge that we have.
Sunita, thank you so much. Your comments are well matched with the cloudy skies that I see right in front of my window here. But you know, even within those cloudy skies, there's always hope for a few rays. And so you did point to some of the rays that we were thinking about. Just your last point about repurposing sewage. I mean, I don't think this audience needs any reminder that India is also the country that repurposed gobar. to use it or cow dung, used for so many different purposes. So there is a tradition of doing that. But you placed the journey of India's journey to 2047 not strictly within India, but placed it in a global context. And you started with the comment that this is a complicated time in world history, and we are living in a more insecure world than any of us can remember. And then sort of coming back to many of the domestic issues, such as sustainability. How do we just continue? Even with the current rates of growth, how do we just continue with our resources, continually being polluted and diminished, and the fact that more people have access to a phone than they have access to a toilet. And the fact that this very, very large population, a working age population of about 950 million right now, how do we give them jobs? And so lots of issues, domestic, but putting it in the global context, and talking about those tensions. Let me turn to Shankar Menon to just help us consider that global context. This is an area that you think and write about, and have been an active practitioner in. So, what any reactions to what you heard from Sunita, and do you have any rays of sunshine in terms of where the world is currently, of course, and where we might go, and how might that affect India's growth trajectory?
Well, I wouldn't call them rays of sunshine. But, I agree with Sunita, actually, that if you look around the world today, you're seeing this transition from
Can I call you back, like maybe in an hour and a half?
Increasing integration of trade, of politics, technology, and now it's fragmenting, whether it's politics, economics, and so on. And you've seen increasing ineffectiveness of multilateral institutions, of negotiations, of climate diplomacy, for instance. I mean, there has not been a binding international agreement of any consequence for decades. I mean, there have been agreements like Paris where states agree that they will decide what they will do, but nobody is going to check what they do. And frankly, these have not actually moved us to the goals that we have set for ourselves. So yes, it's a difficult world. But never forget, this is the normal state of history. For most of history, we haven't had a world order. We haven't had global institutions. And if you actually look for the times of the most innovation in history, they were times of chaos. Look at this axial age, 6th century BC. And the warring states in China, you look at Sung China, which produces printing, paper, gunpowder. I mean, this is when the country is completely divided and falling apart politically. So I'm not so sure that we need to say, oh, because there's no world order. That's what the hegemon wants you to believe. But innovation, creativity comes out of this kind of situation. I mean, and that's our consistent. Tension is creative. I mean, for India, what does that mean? It means we can't look for global solutions. We can't look for multilateral solutions. You can't go looking for, frankly, climate diplomacy and so on. I think we've seen what happened. That we need to, therefore, A, rely on ourselves, but B, much more opportunistic and chase and concentrate on what's actually important for India's development, rather than chasing status goals or, approbation and applause. And I think for me, I would list them from my point of view. First, you need peace. You need peace. You need to be at peace with yourself, and you need to be at peace with your periphery, certainly. You need peace in your periphery if you want to develop your country and do it properly. And that's true of all the countries which have made that transition from low-income status to. How do you get peace? You prepare for war. So I'm afraid you need a parabellum. So I'm adding to Montague's fiscal worries, because there's no question that you will need to spend much more on defense. You will need to restructure the way you go about your defense. And you can't rely on the international system for it anymore. The second, of course, for me, the biggest worry is really energy. Because as of now, I don't see a clear pathway forward, which guarantees for us the amount of energy that we need if we are to develop the country. And especially when I see the way, international negotiations take place, they still reflect the existing balance of power in the world. I mean, why are we talking about discontinuing coal, but gas, the other fossil fuel, is somehow a transitional fuel? Oil is not even mentioned. I mean, it's an absurd situation. So it seems to me that energy is going to be critical. And since there won't be global solutions, we'll have to start doing what we have been doing opportunistically. When Russia invades Ukraine for the second time, we take advantage of what's going on and get Russian oil and get it cheap. But that's not a long-term solution. If you want to grow for 25 years, even at 6.5%, that's not and that for me is the biggest constraint that I can see that we'll need to address. There is a larger mental problem where in the choice between engagement with the world and working with the world, or those in the world who we can work with, and our sense of exceptionalism, that India is unique, that India has this great history, we can manage it all, we're big enough. Atmanirbharta is defined differently by different Indians. There are those who actually still look at it as import substitution and entirely self-reliant growth, and others who recognize that that's not really where you can be somewhere else on the spectrum. And that problem, I don't think we have simple solutions for. Look at China. Today, you're in a situation where you have a political impasse on the border. You've had 4 years of over 100,000 troops from both sides lined up in the Western sector in the most inhospitable places. And yet they're your biggest trading partner last year. They overtook the US. And that's continuing. And the Indian dependence on China economically is structural today. I saw somewhere that almost 28% of the value add in our exports is of Chinese origin. I don't know if that's true, but I'm prepared to believe that it's pretty high, I mean, the proportion. So somewhere on that spectrum between exceptionalism and autonomy and engagement at the other end, we need to find, and I think it'll have to be, given the fractured nature of the world, it will have to be horses for courses, depending on the sector, depending on what you speak on, we'll have to play the field and we'll have to build coalitions on issues across the board. On climate, for instance, I think we need to do much more with other people. But I would warn against one thing, which, we shouldn't fall for calls for India to set a good example or display leadership in international negotiations, assuming obligations that other people are not willing to accept themselves, unless there are immediate concrete outcomes. Because in this kind of world, it really is, when in doubt, we should go back to the basics, to the UNFCCC, the principles of equity, of justice, of responsibility. And because what's happened so far, frankly, has only entrenched and widened the gap between the haves and have-nots, between the developed countries and the developing countries. And that's what we've seen in the last decade and a half. And that's not something which makes our job easier to develop India. I don't think that answers your question, but for me, that's the framing and within which I would look at it.
Well, I had no illusions that my question was that readily answerable, but Shankar, you have added several more dimensions to the answer, and the recurring theme that I keep getting is all the frictions that are tied into these answers. Whether it has to do with the fact that we have failed as a global community to reach international agreements that are binding and that nations adhere to. And you closed with the notion of India not trying to go it alone and building coalitions. So I see a tension right there, which is there isn't a great track record countries collaborating, and at the same time, we need that collaboration. And the autonomous India is not a sustainable one. Of course, you added to Montek's a notion that we need to look at the fiscal needs of the country, and that ties into investments in defense, investments in energy, and then kind of engaging with the world. Let me ask Ulka, from your perspective, as you sort of connect all these different issues. We have been talking, quite frequently about the energy needs. Sunita touched on the need for inclusion and inclusivity and the state of the human condition. These are issues that you and your organization, WRI, sort of connects a lot with. So how do you see the journey to 2047 from your vantage point?
Thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you for including me in this very fascinating conversation. I was listening to everyone who spoke before me, and it seems like such a daunting challenge. And what I thought in my mind I could focus on was one worker who actually goes through this Vikasit Bharat period, right? Or maybe a one woman worker, and sort of think of it from her perspective. What a lot of people have been saying is that as India becomes a developed country, we've seen other developed countries go down that path, and they're bound to increase their energy demand. That's what everyone said. There is no rich country that's energy poor. The question for India is, can you increase energy without increasing emissions? And while a lot of us have been thinking about carbon emissions, from the perspective of that one woman worker, what's really more immediate is air pollution. Air pollution and heat stress, something which is already affecting worker productivity. There are stories of MSMEs that are having to start their shifts at 2 a.m. because of the afternoon heat stress. And women workers are not able to get to the MSMEs, to their workplace at that time of night. So that's something that we'll have to really keep in mind. The addressing air pollution, one, by actually regulating and enforcing the laws that are there, but more importantly, by protecting the dwindling green spaces that we have. That is going to be a big challenge, or a big need, rather, in this process. The second is, what if this woman is in a rural area and the new green jobs that are being created are not quite reaching there? How can rural livelihoods be made more resilient to climate change, as well as to other types of environmental stresses that are happening? But really, the third and the most important part of this is investment in human capital, as others have also said before me, but specifically skilling. We've all talked about the size of the Indian workforce, but the labor force participation rate of women is still quite small. Only 5% of the workforce, less than 5% of the workforce in India is formally skilled, compared to something like 50% for developed countries. How are these women supposed to access these skilling opportunities, access these new green jobs? That is really the big challenge for me. And what our modeling shows, we've been doing a lot of systems dynamics modeling that looks at the energy sector and the economy as a whole. And we find that as these investments happen in the electricity sector, in the green building sector, in the electric mobility sector, something like 2 million jobs a year could be created in these sectors, in electricity, manufacturing, and construction. Of course, 2 million is quite small compared to the size of the workforce that's entering every year. But if you dig deeper down into the manufacturing sector, we find that jobs are likely to increase in specialized manufacturing industries, specialized metals manufacturing, and other types of specialized electrical equipment. And that's just the nature of this net zero transition. So that's going to be where the focus will need to be on, so that people, and especially women workers, are able to actually benefit from the Viksit Bharat trajectory.
Thank you, Ulka. This is yet another a very important dimension that you have shined a light on, and thank you for taking us from these elevated views that we've been taking, at a macro level, and bringing it down to the ground, from the perspective of an individual. And of course, there are many such individuals that we know are affected by, air pollution, are affected by the fact that their livelihoods aren't really being affected by the bigger transitions or the commitments to a green transition or other investments that are being made largely in the urban areas. And the fact that labor force participation rates across the country are low, and they're particularly low and shamefully low for women, and that number really hasn't budged. As we look across this breadth of challenges and still retain hope that this journey towards 2047, we get to some semblance of advancement, a break out of the middle income trap that Montek reminded us of. Let me turn to Lavish. Lavish, CSAP does so much work across all of these issues. How do you bring all these different strands that have been raised by Montek, by Sunita, by Shankar, by Ulka? How do you bring them all together? And what are your reflections on that journey?
Thanks, Bhaskar. So first, we are, the way I see it, we are not making the 2047 target. We are not making either on the growth end or the transition. The world is not going to meet any of these targets. But that is as of today, based on information, technologies, institutions that are available to us today. So essentially, the problem is you break it up. Let's look at it only for the next 5 to 10 years. And let's prepare for the major changes that we would need to do after 2035. By that time, hopefully, we would have lower cost technologies on the energy side or on the storage side. We would have had some evolution of global institutions on the financial institutions as well. So perhaps funding will be far more likely to access. So essentially, the problem that we need to focus on is for the next 10 years. And there I'll draw on what Montek said. There is a very serious problem that countries in the middle income segments face, and which is essentially to do with institutions. Now, the great thing about reforming institutions is that they're very difficult to do, yes, but they're not so costly. Now, I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples. I see that there are 3 classes of institutions in India that need to be changed. And whether we do it now or we do it 10 years later, they definitely, the earlier we do it, the better. First, judicial delays. It's a massive hit on the economy, whether it is locked assets or contracting problems or problems related to entry of poor people into the economic mainstream, the large informal sector. All of these are actually outcome, in a sense, of the judicial delays that we have. We do, and we can change it. It's essentially a matter of getting better coordination between the judiciary and the government. One. Second, there's a huge capacity problem in the government. And this is across all tiers of the government. We have a problem of technocracy. Technocracies, many believe, have actually degraded over a period of time within the government. Those need to be changed. There's no way, and when I'm talking about technocracy, I'm not limiting myself to economists or statisticians, something that's been in the media lately. But also, we are talking about engineers, we're talking about environmental professionals, we're talking about lawyers. The government definitely needs to have a fairly massive investment within itself on this. So that's the second part. Third, again, it's been mentioned, but I would focus most on primary education. There is no way we can either do skilling or hire human capital if we don't get our primary education right. And it doesn't cost that much. There are only a preset things that we need to do, and they are not costly. So I think what India needs to do is focus on institutions, get them right, wait for the new opportunities to arise, whether it's globally or whether it's on the technology side.
Thank you, Lavish. Institutions, and you said that they are difficult to change, but not costly to change. So there is, I'm still grasping for those rays of sunshine. And you have very clearly kind of laid out three, important leverage points. Let me, and the leverage points being, kind of addressing the issue of judicial delays, and you talked about locked assets and the problems relating to how one shifts the us from a high reliance on the informal sector to more formal employment. Of course, the judicial delays also delays India's growth in the manufacturing sector, because a lot of those delays result in factories not being able to be set up and so on and so forth, and concerns about capacity in the government, and of course the widespread lack of education across the board, starting with primary education. So a number of great ideas there, and also sort of pulling us in closer to where we are. Let's focus on the next 10 years. Let me ask Montek. Montek, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, I thought I'd just clarify a couple of points. One where I don't quite agree with Shankar. Shankar sort of made it look as if things are getting worse for developing countries. That's not actually true. The economic structure of the world is changing in favor of emerging market economies. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's simply not true that nothing is happening. The truth of the matter is Europe is in deep trouble. Mario Draghi has given them a very Indian-like set of recommendations, a list of recommendations that all economists will agree with, but everyone knows they're not going to do it. So the fact of the matter is Japan is not likely to be growing rapidly. Europe is not likely to be growing rapidly. And the United States is also not likely to be growing rapidly, because quite honestly, total factor productivity in these places is not increasing as was thought. And the assumption that artificial intelligence or some such thing would provide an automatic boost is now being questioned. I mean, maybe it's an S-shaped curve, but it's going to take longer for actual productivity benefits to generate. On the other hand, emerging markets are in a position where they can suddenly do a whole lot of things that earlier they were not able to do if we get our act together. I know that's a very big if, but on any consideration, if you were sitting and making plans in the US or in Europe, you would recognize that South Asia and East Asia are going to be much more important, and you better sort of decide on how to deal with this part of the world, because that's where the dynamism is going to come from. For a variety of reasons, Latin America doesn't seem to be able to break out of its present lethargy. And of course, Africa remains a problem, low development levels, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a change. The only thing is the concept of the South is a bit meaningless. I mean, I keep telling my colleagues that there's no point in India trying to be the voice of the global South, because the global South is a highly heterogeneous commodity. So we really need to look at what are the emerging markets that are likely to do well, and how can we do as well in this group as is possible for us. The rest of the world's problems, we have a small share in that, and we need not pretend that we're going to take a lead role in that area. Second point, which is very important, and I think Shankar also drew attention to it, energy. There is no question that our ambitions cannot possibly be met without an assured supply of energy. But the big change that has occurred in technology is that earlier there wasn't an economically viable alternative energy source. Now there is. RE, wind and solar, and frankly, looking ahead, nuclear also, which we haven't done enough about. These are sources which could provide the energy we need to grow. But of course, we need to also be a lot more energy efficient. It's not possible to be energy efficient if you want to keep energy prices low. This is a very fundamental thing that our politicians will have to learn. Yes, there's a case for helping the poor cope with higher energy prices, no, there's no case for keeping energy prices low. If we could build on the sort of digitalization network or whatever, which we keep saying is working and we are for it and it is being used to transfer money, etc. We need to get a political, if you like, the politics must wake up and say that, look, a strong India is not an India that is going to depend on cheap energy prices. There are problems with solar. I mean, after all, it's going to require a lot of land. And I mean, there's also the problem that we need a lot more afforestation to handle the kind of adaptation we need to do. So you're going to have more land needed for afforestation, more land needed for solar and maybe even wind. This means basically that we will have to reduce the land available for agriculture. But you know, agricultural productivity in India is about half of what it should be. So there's really no, in my view, if we are willing to accept the structural changes needed in agriculture, and I'm not talking about a 20-year horizon, 20 or 25-year horizon, there's no reason why that can't be done. And in little bits and pieces here and there, it's happening. But you know, on the other hand, there are tremendous opposition. For example, the very strong, I was going to say NGO, but with Sunita looking at me, I kind of feel a bit hesitant. The NGO community needs to take a view on genetically modified crops. I mean, you know, we are holding back domestic developments in GM, which could lead to a fantastic increase in productivity on the grounds that will cause unbelievable damage. Although these things are being used in the United States all the time. I mean, we're importing refined oil, which uses GM, but we're not willing to allow the GM crops to be grown in India. Frankly, it doesn't make any sense at all. So I think the problem is that these are not problems that are going to be solved altogether for the next 50 years. I think we need to break it up. And that's why what I've been writing, by the COP 30, which happens in Brazil, we have to submit new INDCs, independent, nationally determined contributions, which Shankar rightly described as a form of negotiation in which everybody decides whatever they want to do. And there's no way of judging whether they're actually doing it. Anyway, that's the system we've got. So far, we've really not made what I would call commitments that indicate how do we expect emissions to, what trajectory will our emissions be put on, consistent broadly with our net zero in 2070. I think we can do that. Certainly we can't cut down coal immediately, just as Shankar said, that it's hypocritical in the West to be just focusing on coal and not focusing at all on oil and natural gas. True. And I think we should make that point. But at the same time, if we're going to get to net zero by 2070, we have to recognize that we need to phase thermal power out. I think we should indicate to the world that India's emissions are going to increase for a while and then peak and then go down. I think if the world were convinced that we are on a path which will bring that about, then we will at least be in a different space. Right now, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the West that India is not willing to reduce emissions at all, which is not actually true. So I think we need to convert the whole thing into what can we do in 10 years. It's not going to be easy, but I think we need a much broader discussion domestically, and we need both technocrats and NGOs and civil society and research institutions laying out all these things and sort of raising the issues that are politically controversial. I think that's the only way we're frankly going to get progress. If we just sit around waving slogans around, that's going to be of no use whatsoever.
Great. Thank you, Montek. You mentioned so many important points, and I'm sure.
By the way, one other thing, can I pitch it? That's very important. That how open should India be is a crucial question, particularly since the West is leading the deglobalization campaign and in effect consciously de-globalizing. Obviously, this is driven by an anti-China kind of sentiment, but the extent of resort to tariffs goes much beyond China. Now, Jake Sullivan says, small yard, high fences, but that's not what's actually happening. Fences are being put up all over the place. What should India do? Now, I mean, there will be a problem. There will be a pressure domestically that, look, wake up and smell the coffee. The rest of the world has given up on globalization. And if they're retreating from globalization, shouldn't we? I think that would be a mistake. I mean, our view, we are much more closed than the rest of the world. So although it's regrettable that there is a bit of a retreat, India needs to continue to open up. And I mean, particularly from my point of view, if the rest of the world is entering into a set of policies that are aimed at limiting China, they will have an adverse effect on global trade for sure, given the importance of China. And that will reflect badly on us also. But to the extent to which they are containing China, but willing to friend-shore, that's the old China plus one, India has an opportunity. We cannot exploit that opportunity if we decide to close up. So we have a real choice on trade policy. How do we remain sufficiently open to be able to step in the areas where China is likely to retreat, which it is likely to. So that's a big, big issue, which it's really our issue and it's not for the world, but it's something that we have not adequately addressed so far. I mean, right now, we have people sort of saying, look, we need solar panels, but the Chinese are selling solar cells at half the world price. That's bad, so we should prevent them from doing so, which means the rest of the world will build their solar energy on Chinese prices, and we will build ours on double those prices, which is not going to do much for our competitiveness. How do we handle this? I don't have a simple solution, but I don't think we're having an adequate debate on it, and I think we need that.
Great. So Montek, you covered so many issues, and there was a bit of an arc in your comments that I'd like to point out, which is you started with emerging markets being the source of dynamism in the global economy, and sort of a stagnation in the developed world. You talked about Europe, Japan, United States, all going through some doldrums. I found it interesting that you mentioned emerging markets. You talked about South Asia, you talked about East Asia, you talked about LATAM and Africa, but the one name that you did not mention was China. And then you came at the end, back to China, and and of course, so much of the conversation around deglobalization and the future of emerging markets, hangs on China. I mean, China itself has gone through blistering growth, and now it's not blistering anymore. So what's the future of China, Qua China, and also what's the future of the China plus one? And how does India take advantage of that situation? And what are some of the changes that it needs to make from a policy perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, in order to be able to fill the gap? Let me turn first to Shankar, perhaps to give him a chance to respond to Montek's comments, particularly given that the China part of the theme that ran through it. And then I turn to Sunita. Shankar, go ahead.
Well, two very quick points in response to what Montek said. Maybe I wasn't clear when what I said earlier. I think what I meant was, if you look at the last decade and a half, you've seen the gap between the big two, China and the US, and the rest of the world actually growing. And you now have a situation where large chunks of the world, Africa is a case in point, I mean, the IMF says is actually dropping off the map. So to say emerging markets is where our future is, I don't think is sufficient for many of the things that we need if we are to develop India. The IMF says 53 developing countries are either in a debt crisis or very close to default. And we've done nothing about it for the last 6 years. I mean, every year the G20 says something about it. And this is true of increasing, and it's this kind of instability is going to affect you. You might not, Sri Lanka might not be a major part of your economy, or Bangladesh, or Maldives. But what happens there does affect your security and your ability to grow and frankly, your ability to develop India. And this is why I say you need a peaceful periphery. But my point is not that, oh, there's a great future in the Global South. Not at all. In fact, the Global South is allergic to people who claim to speak for it. We've been through colonialism. The last thing we want is somebody who thinks they speak for us. So I think I agree with you entirely. I think but the big irony in today's situation is, frankly, the Chinese need globalization more than anybody else in the world because they can't do without it. China depends on the world, and it's a strange irony. They've grown rapidly, but today they depend on the world for food. They're the only large temperate country which can't feed themselves, for energy, for commodities, for markets. They are the ones who need the rest of the world to keep their economy going. While they're going through this tremendous readjustment, and their growth rates have fallen since 2015, certainly, but even earlier, I mean, the decline started, and they have structural problems, demography, etc. We all know those. So given that it's the Chinese who need globalization, but they want to do it on their terms. They'll do it under Chinese auspices. And you have a choice. Are you going to say kuti and ignore them? I mean, that's not a policy. You can't. Do you think you can develop India if you have bad relations with one of the two biggest economies in the world, which is also your neighbor, and which will translate into political pressure? I don't see that as possible. I really don't think that's true. And when you say that we won't enter RCEP because the Chinese are in RCEP, but you're going to trade with everybody else in RCEP who's trading with China. And where do you draw the line? I mean, today, frankly, rules of origin have become so hazy, and especially when you get to services, it's very hard, I think, for anybody to say, I'm going to cut myself off. I agree entirely with Montek that we shouldn't be closing ourselves off. But if you're not closing yourself off, you can't do without China. So you need to find some way of dealing with this, and that's where, even if I just take Lavish's limited time frame, I'm not too optimistic, because we've worked ourselves into this present impasse, and frankly, what we both seem to be doing now is both declaring victory and deciding to move on, but it hasn't addressed any of the issues.
Thank you, Shankar. Sunita, and as you offer your comments and respond to what you just heard, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on Montek's comments about the need for India to increase its emissions, because that is going to be needed for the growth that we are anticipating and hoping for. And then eventually those emissions are going to go down. And simultaneously making a green transition, and whether the transition is to wind and solar or green hydrogen, which seems to be a big issue that it keeps coming back in the green transition discussion. There's also an estimate from the World Economic Forum that if India were to seriously undertake a green transition, it could create 50 million new jobs. So how realistic do you think those scenarios are? But go ahead, Sunita.
So thank you, Bhaskar. In fact, you framed it very well. And that's really where my response also to Montek's point, and him stereotyping me as this sort of banner-holding NGO. Thank you, Montek. On one point, I totally agree with the Indian government's position on the energy, the way they have framed the energy transition moving ahead. The way the Indian government has framed it is to say that we will have to double our energy consumption between now and 2030. And there is absolutely no doubt we're going to have to increase energy usage in India. We have a huge energy poverty, and the only difference I have with Montek is the price is not just the only issue, and I'll come back to that. But we need to double our energy consumption. The way the Indian government has framed it, and something that we have supported, and we have actually been writing a lot and taking on a lot of our Western NGO colleagues and saying that India cannot get out of coal. And I very firmly believe in this. We cannot get out of coal. We are today totally dependent on coal. It's the cheapest form of energy we have. We need to talk about a different future for coal, and I'll come to that. But as far as the Indian government position has been, is to say we cannot get out of coal, but the growth in our doubling of energy will come out of clean sources. So between now and 2030, as we double, we will actually do that by moving our renewable energy to 450 gigawatts. And that, and the data is very clear that 450 or 550, you could end up meeting the bulk of your electricity needs. So instead of coal disappearing, you would bring down coal from 70 to 50, and you would increase your renewable energy share, which is today about 9%, to around 40%. And I'm talking about new renewables. Then, of course, there's hydel, and there is nuclear attached to it. Now, I think this framing is a framing which is very solid as we move on. The questions here become threefold. One, what do we do with coal? In my view, and CSC has done a lot of work on this and has pushed for policy reform, is that we need to clean up coal. We need to do it not just for climate change, but we need it for local air pollution needs. In the city of Delhi, we have phased out our last coal-based power plant. We have banned coal in industries in Delhi, but we know we cannot do it across. So for us, cleaning up coal. In 2015, the government of India came up with new emission standards to be enacted by 2017. We still don't have them happening. Now, that would mean cleaner coal from a local particulates point of view. We would still need to invest, and that's where the world needs a conversation, because the world has got this crazy idea that we're going to get out of coal and they will get into gas. And they will find that they can clean up their gas, but they don't talk about how we can clean up our coal. And we need to talk really about the fact that we need to have a clean coal strategy, because we cannot get out of coal. But we can move very fast to the renewable energy. Now, that's got a number of obstacles as well, and we need to recognize it. And that's where I agree with Shankar that we need to be much more realistic, and we need to drive where are the barriers and how do we fix them. One of the biggest questions is the question of land, it's the question of access, it's the question of finance. Let's be real about this. We are still at 9%, Bhaskar, 9% of our electricity generation today is coming out of new renewable sources. We need to move it to 40%. Okay? And there are real questions there, and we need to discuss that to figure out where are the barriers and how do we upscale that. Now, one of the barriers here, and that I have this disagreement, Montek, is not the price. In fact, Montek, and I'd love your take on this and your research on this, if you look at the energy prices in India, they're one of the highest in the world. The only reason Indian industry is energy efficient even today is because the price of energy is high. And the price of energy is higher because it is so insecure. Most Indian industry has to depend on captive generation. Most Indian industry has to depend on dirty sources also, like coal, but their own sources of energy. So cost of energy also for a household are very high. And the worst is the unaffordability of energy is what is creating the problem. If women in India do not have clean sources of cooking, and they cannot get energy at affordable rates, they will continue to use biomass. And that will continue to go into the same airshed that all of us live. So I think the affordability of energy, and that's where the renewable energy question, and it's coming up in the West, Bhaskar. So the West, who preaches to us about the fast transition that is needed. Today, the cost of electricity in the West is going up. The cost of fuel in the West is going up. And look at the outrage there. I mean, the Queen, the former Queen, of course, she's deceased now, but the former Queen of England termed herself as energy poor. And there are huge issues in UK today about energy poverty. Now, I mean, that's the price of the transition. And we need to understand that and get real about it and not paper it over with all these nice jobs about, oh, jobs will be created. Electrification is leading to a huge tension in the US because the jobs are not coming. The green transition in steel is actually leading to less jobs, which is leading to the Tatas having to negotiate with the UK government as they move toward the electric arc furnace. So let's get a little more real. Let's get more tangible about this and not be lost in this whole world about, the nice stuff which doesn't add up. And that's my last point. And Montek, you and I have to sit down on agriculture because GM is an old story. The big issue for agriculture today is really how are you going to grow food at lower cost of cultivation? How are you going to put more money in the hands of farmers? And that's where the big question about soil fertility, biodiversity, all those issues are getting much more real today. And I think we have huge opportunities here not to go the American disastrous way of growing food at costs that nobody can afford, and they're having to subsidize their agriculture, whether it's Europe or the US, and they're growing food, which is making everybody fat and is not nutritious. So I think we need to get our food story, and I look forward to a conversation, and that'll have to be bilateral between me and Montek to fix this food issue. Thank you.
Sunita, thank you so much. And when you do have that bilateral conversation, please send us the Zoom link so that all 500 of us can peer into that again, because I'm sure that will be another discussion that we would love to be a part of. I do have some questions for Lavish and Ulka, and I'll give Montek a chance to respond to Sunita as well. And I'm going to try and squeeze all that into a rather disappearing window of time. But let me very quickly turn to a question that has come from the audience. And this is an issue that is enormously important, as we all know, and touches on many of the issues that, Sunita, you just mentioned about, certainly growing food and so on. But we haven't touched on, which is the water crisis. And how do we think about the ongoing water crisis? Of course, that's tied to climate change. It's tied to where we are in terms of the agricultural sector and the energy needs. Ulka, any thoughts on the state of water in India, and what do we do about it?
Sure, happy to talk about water from three perspectives. One is you spoke about green hydrogen, and one of the pieces of that's less talked about is that it needs a lot of water. And while it's possible to locate these in, say, coastal areas and desalinize coastal water, seawater, there is definitely a cost of that. I think Australia is doing it in that way. The other part of the water puzzle is that that on the positive side, renewable energy actually uses less water than thermal power or nuclear power. So there is a very significant saving of water, and as this net zero transition happens. No, Sunita doesn't agree. I think for solar power in particular,
thermal power actually excretes the water. It's a discharge. You can clean it. Solar power needs a lot of water for cleaning.
No longer. Good. Because the MNRE has actually passed a technical order which says all the new installation of solar power must have robotic dry cleaning. So it actually is not supposed to use any water, which kind of goes to show the power of simple government orders as well, that you can actually fix problems once they're recognized, at least some problems. The third part that I'll talk about with water is also linked to this issue of just transition. And while we've talked about some parts of the just transition, skilling, for example, a larger part of it is social safety nets, because for the workers who will be laid off or for the older workers who are due to retire, there will be a need for pensions and safety nets. And at the moment in India, the biggest social safety net, or the only perhaps version of universal basic income, is the MNREGA. And if the MNREGA work can be used to create more climate resilient assets in rural areas, for example, in Uttarakhand during COVID, it has been used for rejuvenating mountain springs. In other parts of arid South India, MNREGA work has been focused on building on watershed development and recharging rainwater harvesting structures. So if that can be done, then a lot of these connections can be made of protecting water, of generating livelihoods, of creating climate resilient assets, and also of having social safety nets for the just transition related to any changes that are happening. So I think it's important to look at all of these things in a connected way and not just one-off. But certainly in some of the aspects that we're talking about, whether it is green hydrogen or something else, it will be important to look at water. Crop choice, of course, is another one that Sunita has, I think, indirectly mentioned when she spoke about the cost of cultivation. That's another important way in which water can be conserved. Pause there, maybe hand over to Lavish.
Lavish, you've been very patient. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to bring up, I mean, from this water issue, we've mentioned it a bit, but we really haven't discussed it enough, and that's adaptation. And the point I'd like to make is that if you do not adapt, and if you don't start that process now, 10 years hence, we won't have the surpluses to continue our mitigation actions. This is something that you need to start now, and water is a very large part of that whole adaptation process. I mean, it's a very large component. In fact, if I had $1 and I could only, I would actually put all of it on adaptation rather than mitigation. Because mitigation, I can still, I mean, if I'm an adapted economy, then I can still continue with the mitigation process a bit later, when hopefully the technologies would be better. So I think we should not be divorcing adaptation from this whole mitigation story. In fact, it is a very important component into this.
Great. Thank you for that very important and timely comment there, Lavish. If I could just ask you a further question, and this is perhaps going in a somewhat different direction. We've been talking about many of these issues from the perspective of policy and the role of government and the social sector. What's the role of the private sector in all of this? Whether it is adaptation, as you talk about, or the green transition that we've been touching on quite a lot. And when we talk about the private sector, so obviously there's private sector within India and the private sector globally. And I'm wondering, Lavish, if you have a point of view on that.
So first, the private sector will evolve as per the ecosystem, which is broadly defined by the state. Cannot really expect, at least in this space, for the private sector to spontaneously come up with solutions at the national or at the global level. It just cannot happen. The governments will need to provide the direction, and prices may be one, regulations could be another, and so on. That's one. Second, I think the major role that private sector can play in this is on development and scaling fast. And the classic example that I give is that of China, where all of those innovations that had happened in Europe, Chinese could take them up and just scale them up so rapidly. And in fact, the world must thank China for that, especially on the RE space. So I would actually take something from there, that the role of the private sector is to be able to just scale some of these emerging technologies quick enough. And that's what it needs to work on the most.
Great. Thank you, Lavish. Montek?
Thanks. I may have to leave a little earlier, so if you don't think it's rude, let me say my bit now, and I will then withdraw from the session. So a few disconnected responses. One, on Sunita's point that energy is very expensive in India. Now, actually, what is happening is that it's because of the incredible cross-subsidization that some portions of the industry or some of the energy consumers are paying an unduly high price because others are getting the energy very low. And typically, we are underpricing it massively for farmers, which is really only a way of extracting water, which actually we should be taxing water if you want to be an economist. But in fact, we're subsidizing the use of water, which doesn't make any sense. And along with that is a growing popular sort of populist movement, if you like, that you need to give urban consuming household, including in Delhi, which is one of the richest parts of the country, so much free electricity. I mean, as a result, it's industry and the commercial sector that's actually burdened with higher rates. So, we have to recognize that the reason electricity prices are high, twofold. One is the quality is low because the discoms financially are in a very poor position because we don't allow them to make a decent profit on whatever job they're doing. And the second is there's far too much cross-subsidy. But a similar problem in agriculture. I mean, for example, I agree with everything Sunita said on what we need to do. But, you know, the ludicrous subsidization of nitrogenous fertilizer in India is something that no politician feels able to handle. So we need to work out, is there some way in which this kind of fertilizer subsidy can be converted into a grant to farmers so that the price system isn't distorted? At the moment, people are overutilizing fertilizers, which is actually reducing soil fertility. All the kinds of things that Sunita mentioned. Unfortunately, while many of the NGOs who are genuinely concerned about these things point to the problems, they don't point to the distortive policies that are causing those problems. I've not heard a single NGO argue that we should abolish the fertilizer subsidy. I mean, frankly, that is a very sensible thing to do. Converting it into a grant to farmers, which is unconnected with fertilizer use, so they can use it for whatever they want. I mean, that's one example. The other point that I want to mention is that, you know, I think Lavish rightly said that adaptation is extremely important. You know, the reason we ignore adaptation and go on and on about mitigation is the belief that mitigation is a classic case of external benefits external to the country, whereas adaptation is not a case of external benefits external to the country. Whatever benefits there are of adaptation, we will get as a country. Only thing is, it won't be a private benefit, so it has to be done by the government. Mitigation is a different animal because, I mean, since it's a global thing, there's some presumption that people will be willing to pay for mitigation. Now, actually, factually, they're not actually willing to do it because there's no evidence of willingness to dish out that money. But I think countries like India at least believe that they will get nothing to pay for adaptation. That only means we have to do it ourselves. And that's what brings in the fiscal capacity issue that I had mentioned earlier. Now, finally, what Sunita said, I don't think it's a solution to say we can't do without coal. I mean, that seems to imply that we're going to be burning whatever it is, 1 billion tons of coal. It's just all the extra energy is going to come from RE. That's not true. I personally think we could very easily think of a peaking of coal use in power, maybe sometime towards, say, 2040, and then slowly bring it down. I mean, after all, it's quite possible, by the way, that we can't completely get away from coal. But then, you know, 30 years down the road, it may be possible to sort of say, well, carbon capture and usage provides a way of neutralizing the effect of some irreducible use of fossil fuels. But for the next 10 years, we need to clearly indicate that we are moving onto a path where we are graduating away from coal. There's nothing particularly sacred about coal. I mean, there are two kinds of arguments that are made in its favor. One is that we've got it, but we've got sunshine too. So really we're choosing between two domestic endowments. And coal is highly polluting, not only for the world, but as Sunita herself said, because of air pollution, which is causing huge health damage in India. So I think we need to change our tone over there to saying, look, we will have to have some increase in emissions for a while, but then they will peak and come down. And I think the credibility of India's stance should be judged on whether we are taking steps that will ensure that kind of trajectory. I don't think the credibility is maintained if we say the present level of coal use is going to continue, but all future energy is going to come from RE. That's simply not going to work. Well, with those words and apologies to Sunita, we'll have that bilateral conversation that she's offered separately. Will you allow me to exit because I've got to be somewhere else? And if I don't leave now, I'll be seriously late.
Well, Montek, thank you so much. And this has been a tremendous opportunity to benefit from your insights. And long years of pattern recognition. So we thank you, this group here on the screen and everyone who's listening in. Safe travels, and as I mentioned, your bilateral conversation, we might all want to listen to it, or at least whatever takeaways you and Sunita have. So thank you for joining. If I could use this opportunity perhaps to take a bit of a different turn to the conversation, and then we'll do a quick round of the lightning round to sort of round us off, or close us off. It's an issue that we haven't really touched on as much, and I'm wondering how it makes a difference to many of the ideas and concerns that all of you have raised. And that stems from a comment from Nandan Nilekani, which is that India is going to be data rich before it gets rich. And we know that the digital transformation in India has been profound. And from a country that was entirely cash dependent, and at one point cash disappeared, and now it is the largest digital payments country in the world. The talk of digital public infrastructure has been inspired by a lot of developments in India. Data is connected to many of the issues we're talking about. It's relevant to the green transition. It's relevant to many other aspects of development and growth and access to employment. So I'm curious about the role of technology and how you see that as perhaps a leverage point for this journey that we are trying to shed some light on between now and 2047. And I'm opening this up to anybody who would like to comment.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead, Olka.
Thank you. Yes, I can take a stab at it. I think there's a lot of promise in this technology, this approach. In the early stages of it, I think the problems that will be addressed will be the relatively easy problems. For example, a lot of the applications tend to be around carbon credits, managing carbon markets. But I think the real challenge will be when we are talking about the difficult questions, like the water use question that was addressed earlier in this discussion. Data can't create new water when it doesn't exist or if it's been used up. I'll give an intermediate example, not a very easy one and not a very, sort of intractable one, with the question of parametric insurance. There have been some very promising examples of weather indexed insurance or extreme weather insurance, for example, even for heat stress in Gujarat. And it seems like a very ideal application of data-driven technologies. The problem, of course, that happens is that it has a limitation. When you have climate impacts that are as widespread, as frequent, as extreme as the ones that are being projected with climate change, then an entire region or an entire sector gets affected at the same time, and the fundamental logic of insurance breaks down, which is why we are seeing, for example, homeowners insurance being withdrawn in the wildfire regions of California or the hurricane-affected regions of the East Coast. So that's really going to be the challenge for data to actually work with private finance and public finance and come up with a business model that works even in the kinds of new extreme risks that climate change will bring. The conventional business models will help in a situation where there is currently inefficiency or scarcity, but beyond a point, there will be something different needed. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Olka. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Any
I'd like to
comment?
just have a point there. I mean, of course, I mean, at one level, all that data and all those identifications can really help fine-tune many things, whether it's introduction of products or government policies. The problem is it still has to go through the real world for it to yield economic benefits. And a lot of those challenges are actually coming in from there. I mean, I just mentioned, judicial delays, for instance. I mean, if you cannot do contracting, then all of that data actually does not really help. And so you do need the real, well, I'm calling it real, but in the non-digital world to also change. And that needs to be done very fast because the digital side is definitely making some very rapid progress.
Great. So thank you for your observations on that. And of course, the conversation around data and technology could occupy another 1.5 hours of fascinating discussion, which unfortunately today we don't have the luxury of diving into. So let me try and bring this plane down for a landing. Knowing that we have run into quite a bit of turbulence as we try to head towards 2047. And pick up on the words of very wise advice from Lavish, which is, let's look at the next 10 years rather than going so far out. And so in the next 10 years, Lavish, if there was kind of one critical leverage point that you would pick on, obviously you mentioned shifting, making changes in institutions, making changes in judicial delays, for instance. How would you see, if we were to be successful in moving some of those institutions and getting them to be more agile, what would be the one thing that you can see which could accelerate India's journey in the
going
next
forward, even more important than markets is going to be the role of the state. The government needs to invest in itself, and I would invest big time in various capacities, and of course, allocating both responsibilities and accountability at the right notes. So governance is definitely my go-to point for the next 10 years.
Okay, governance from Lavish. Ulka, the next 10 years, what's the one thing that you think would be a leverage point for us to focus on and invest in?
Two things, actually. One, governance, but at the local level. So for city governments, panchayats, district governments, because they're really at the forefront of both climate impacts as well as the transition, have less capacity and are actually being burdened with a lot of responsibilities. Cities have to become climate smart, villages have to become climate resilient, districts have to have climate action plans and climate officers. So that's where a lot of the focus should be. And on the market side, really reforming the electricity sector. 90% or more of our electricity is tied up in long-term power purchase agreements. Even if renewable energy becomes cheaper, people are not able to go for it because of this path dependency. So that's something that is worth focusing on in the next few years.
Great, thank you so much, Ulka. Sunita.
So I agree with everything that Lavish and Ulka have said. I will just add to it that I think the most important question is going to be your question on data and information is going to be our ability to be able to use it. And I think for that, we need to have the ability to be able to listen to different points of view. We are losing that. We're losing that across the world. The world is getting more intolerant. We are getting more closed. And we need to have the ability to be able to do course correction all the time. We do not know how to get there and where it is we're going to get. But to do that, we need voices. And we are because of, I think, all the things that were there at the background of what we talked about, the things that Shankar talked about. We talked about the insecurity in the world. We are getting to be more and more closed. And these closed societies are not intelligent societies. So put all the data you want, all the information you want, but you do not have the ability to learn from it, and you don't have the ability to course correct. And that is going to be one of the biggest issues, in my view. I say this only because I'm one of them who's constantly pointing out to what needs to be course corrected and pointing out that I'm not being listened to. So that's selfish.
Great. No, I think this is a very important reminder. And Sunita, if I may put words in your mouth, we may be data rich, but we are not the knowledge rich or wisdom rich, and that all that data needs to be translated into insights. So, and that insights depends on having openness and open mind and open borders on many issues. Shankar, you get the last word.
Well, I have a very simple thing and I think it takes off from what Sunita was saying. We need to work on the institutions that help us to build social peace, because we're in a society which has gone through such churn and is changing so fast. And all these things we're talking about are going to bring even bigger changes into people's lives. We've pulled them out of familiar surroundings, out of family, clan, village, wherever. We're urbanizing very rapidly. And I think we really need to, there's no external existential threat to India. If there is one, it's internal, it's social. And without social harmony, all that we're talking about, markets and skilling and whatever, will make no sense. So we need to actually work on that because we haven't changed those institutions for years. We haven't actually looked at them in terms of their social impact. I often say that, you know, we've managed to get environmental impact assessments as part of decision making. We need to start making social impact assessments of our policies and our projects and even of our climate policies, I think. We need to start doing that now because I'm really nervous of what's happening. And you can see this in societies around the world. The polarization, the fragmentation, the tendency to use violence, the increasing use of violence in societies. And for me, that's essential, that we need to work on this. We're lucky. We have a relatively, you know, peaceful society compared to others. I mean, there's many people who wonder why there haven't been many mini revolutions. But for me, that's critical going forward.
Yeah, so I think one of the explanations, of course, there are many explanations as to why you know, India hasn't fragmented, and part of it, you know, comes back to maybe this is not the form of adaptation that Lavish had in mind, but it is an incredibly adaptable nation, an incredibly adaptable society. I think it's a good place to pause. You know, coming from our country's foremost foreign policy expert, who says that I've seen the enemy and the enemy is within. It's not, you know, they're not outside our borders. So let's try and address and make friends with, if not the enemy, but at least the antagonist, as we imagine the path ahead, whether we get to 26 trillion or 18 trillion or 10 trillion or just a few trillion more than where we are today in 2047. I'm enormously grateful to Lavish and his team at CSAP. I'm enormously grateful to our team at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for helping organize this this tremendous conversation. And most significantly, I'm so grateful to you, Sunita, you, Ulka, you, Lavish, you, Shankar, and of course, Montek in absence, for sharing your time and your insights with us. I wish we had another 90 minutes, but it is late in New Delhi, and we'll let you all go off and spend time and start your weekend. So thank you so much, and thank you to all our participants who were off screen, who joined us, and many of you who wrote in with your questions. We've recorded your questions, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you on that soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thanks everyone.